All right, good morning. Today is Wednesday, November 2nd, 2022. I sent out this email literally minutes ago, which says today we're going to cover chapter 17, which is file IO from the Murach text, and tomorrow chapter 18. Now, not sure if that's what we're going to do, so let me kind of divert from here for a second and just go back. Now, this is where we are. You already know this. We've gone through sections 1, section 2, and now section 3. Now, there are a few people in the class who sent me emails yesterday that said either I'm totally lost, or I got this partially working, or I got this partially working, but I'm not even sure what I did, etc. So, you know, there always seems to be a point in this class that when we get to section 3, it really gets a hell of a lot harder. And I know I've told you this kind of thing before. All right. And I think when we first started doing it, we first started using classes, it wasn't really all that bad. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I think. And then we got into inheritance and it got a little bit more complex. And then we tried to put everything together and it got even more complex. All right. Now, I'm going to ask something, and I have one person here right now, but I'm going to ask that you not say anything out loud. All right. Now, I looked this morning, and as far as I could tell, unless it's changed, everybody but one person who's in the class had turned in a test. Now, one person had not. You know who you are. I'm not going to say anything. The point, though, is this. I am willing to go tomorrow morning, and rather than go over chapter 18 tomorrow, I am willing to take the test right in front of you and videotape it. Now, if I do that, the first thing is I'm going to double check, and if people have not taken the test, they just get a 0 because I'm putting it out there. It's not at all fair to anybody and everybody who has finished the test. So in other words, I'll do that. But like I said, then if you haven't done the test, then you haven't done the test. All right. And I don't know if doing something like this would help people's understanding, or it would be just almost an exercise in futility, where it's the kind of thing where sort of the rich get richer and the other people just kind of sit there and like, yeah, whatever. So like I said, I'm willing to do this. But if I do this, all right, you always get an email from me every single at the beginning of every class period and at the end of every class period, unless it's a lab day. All right. But if you've ever noticed, if you've ever read the emails that I send at the end of the period, I give you 2 links to the presentations. All right. I give you one link that's right from Microsoft Teams itself, and I give you another link that's to YouTube. Now, if I'm going to go to the trouble of spending an entire class period doing this test, all right, I'm not putting it out on YouTube. Why? Because there's a chance that this test could be used in the future. I don't know. I have no idea. Am I going to use it in the future? I don't know. Is Mr. Gudmisted, who teaches this class in St. Louis, going to use it in the future? I don't know. All right, I really don't. But so what I'd like you to do is 2 things. First of all, and I'm hoping to get an email from every person in the class, and I want you to say 2 things. All right, basically, number 1, I'd like you to go out, and just so you see this, I'm going to change my screen here for a second. So this is the morning email I send. Yeah, I know you've seen all those. However, if I go out here, and for example, I go out here and I look, let's see, for this was yesterday. All right. And yesterday, this is the YouTube thing for yesterday. All right. That was the explanation of the test. And then this is the Teams thing. So if you click here, it goes to YouTube and it gives that explanation. All right, that explanation that's on here on YouTube is the same exact explanation that's here. It's the exact same thing. All right, and if I click here, it brings it up too, but it brings it up basically, and it brings it up kind of inside of Rankin. All right, so what I'm saying is this: I'd like everybody by tomorrow morning to send me an email with two things in there. Number one, can you read this? Because if it turns out that people can't read this, then there's no place for me to put it, and I can't do this because I'm not putting something like this out on YouTube. All right, just because of the ramifications it could have for me. So I'd like you to say first, would it be worth me spending a class period going over and doing this test in front of you? And second, go out to yesterday's email in the afternoon and click on this link and tell me if you can read that, because I would save it out to Teams. And I would probably save it. If I do it tomorrow, I'll put it out there for approximately 24 hours, and then I'm going to remove it. All right. So hopefully what I just said made at least some sense to people. And if it didn't, then send me an email and tell me that you don't understand what I'm talking about. All right. Okay. So with all that said, it's time to go on. So either, today I'm going to go through chapter 17, which is a relatively short chapter. All right. I'm not going to give you any homework from chapter 17. I'm not going to give you any labs from chapter 17. I'm not going to test you on chapter 17 with a hands-on test. I will ask that everybody do for 17 and 18 to do the written tests. What I am hoping to do, and I won't get into this till early next week, is to have us build a project as a class that will implement both file IO and link, so you can see them both in action. All right. Now, one last thing, and then we're going to go on. So if we do that and we can get that thing done early next week, all right, then probably either Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, we'll be going into the last portion of the class right here, the database portion. Now, what I did last year, and I just want to show you this quickly. I'm not trying to waste my time. I'm certainly not trying to waste your time. But what I want to show you is this is the channel for the class. Okay, they've changed the way YouTube looks. All right, but these are the things that I've got out there. So as you can see, there's 84 videos out there right now. All right, and it goes all the way through yesterday. All right, and they're all out here, and they're actually, this is, maybe it's because this has been a totally online class, but they have been viewed a heck of a lot more than most of my other ones. In fact, this is my afternoon class. So if I go back over here and I do a show more and I go to the morning class, there you go. That's the morning class, 88 videos. And again, there's yesterday's, day 50, 10:30, or that's 2 days ago. I'm sorry, the pretest. Well, let's see. Yesterday's, oh, there's day 51. So that was the programming instructions. I just moved that to the top. And I try to put them in that kind of order. So there's 51, 50, day 49 was a lab, etc. So you can figure that out. You're all smart enough to do that. But what I want to tell you is this. If you scroll down to the very bottom, and I mean literally to the very bottom here, what I've done in here, if you don't know this, is I've gone through the book and made and done lectures on my own on the book. All right, and typically on the PowerPoint presentations of the book. You can look through those if it'll help you. You don't have to. But again, I'm right down near the bottom. And now this is what I wanted you to see. I'm going to go back and revisit these because I did these a year ago. But notice what it says in there. It says AWD1000 database fundamentals. And there's part 1, there's part 2, there's part 3, and there's part 4. All right. I'm going to go by, and this weekend, I am going to go through and I am going to look at these 4 different lectures and see if they're worth spending some time going on them in class. because the way that I'm going to handle databases in here, which is the last part of the class, is going to be different than the way I've handled stuff before. What do I mean? We're going to go over chapter 19 at a minimum. Next week, we'll have gone through chapter 19. But before we go through chapters 20 and 21 and 22, and we will go over all of them, but before we go over those last 3 chapters, you have to see databases in action. And when you see databases in action, then hopefully, what you'll start saying is, oh, okay, I can kind of see where this fits into everything. Because the whole idea behind both databases, which is the last section of the book, and chapter 17, which we're about to cover in just a couple minutes, is persistence. Because, right now, if you go and you run a program, okay, and, you've got to make yourself a little calculator. All right, you can go in and you can do all the calculations you want. You can do this, you can do that. You can have an employee program with classes, but nothing persists after you shut the program down. If you want your data to persist, okay, you have to do it in one of 2 ways. You either use files, which we'll talk about in a minute, or you use databases. And in many ways, the stuff that we're going to look at with databases, if you've ever looked at a spreadsheet, in many ways, it's going to look a lot like a spreadsheet. It won't be the same thing, but in many ways, it'll look similar. All right. And I am starting right now to develop this program that I'm creating that's going to allow us to grab everything in chapters 20, 21, and 22. And hopefully we'll be able to put all that stuff into a project. And I'm going to work with you on that project because, you'll still have to do the written tests for 19, 20, 21, and 22, but I don't know if there'll be any homework. I really and truly don't know. I want us to work on this project because I think that's going to help us a lot in our understanding of databases and hopefully bringing together everything that we've talked about. So sorry for that 10-minute interlude, but let's just jump into chapter 17. In fact, before we do, we're on section 4. And again, I don't want to read to you. All right. Just so you know, and you're going to see this in just a moment, there are 2 basic types of files that you can use. There are text files and there are binary files. What's the big difference between them? Text files can be read from a simple editor. And what does that mean? That means this is a PDF file right here, all right, that I've got on my screen. If I tried to bring this file up and I tried to bring it up inside of Notepad, for example, it would look like garbage because it's not a text file. And a product like Notepad or Notepad++, etc., they will only read text files. All right. So we're going to concentrate on text files in here in this chapter and not worry too much about the binary files. We will talk about them, but that's the big difference between them. The other thing is when we get to chapter 18, all right, we're going to talk about link. And, depending on the book you read, it either means line item query, line inventory query, line, it's something with queries. But the big thing is this. When you work with databases, which we'll get to in chapter 19, in most databases, the ones that we'll look at, we're going to look at 2 different types of databases, but the ones that you look at have to be very regimented in the way that they're set up. When you ask a database questions, it's called writing a database query. You have to do it in a certain way, and the database has to be set up in a certain way. The reason I'm telling you this is when you work with LINQ, it allows you to basically run database-like operations on non-database data. And if that doesn't make sense to you, well, when we go over the next lecture on chapter 18, then hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense to you. All right, so with that said, let's jump into this. So as it says, we're going to learn to work with file input and output. It's typically referred to as file IO, like you see right there. It says there, although binary files are required for some applications, text files are preferred whenever possible. Why? They're typically going to be smaller. As it says, they're less platform dependent. So in other words, if I've got a file, if I had this PDF that you have right here, and if you can imagine, it wouldn't have the formatting in it and stuff. But if I had this as a big .txt file, I could read it virtually on any device. All right. But if I've got a brand new computer and I don't have Adobe Acrobat on there, or I don't have anything that reads PDF, I'm not going to be able to read this file right here because it's a binary file. All right. Now, the good news is virtually everything that we'll talk about right now for text files will apply to binary files. They work the same way, except that rather than using, for example, file stream, we'll use like a binary file stream, etc. All right. So pretty much it's going to work the same way as what I'm going to tell you. All right. Now, I'm not going to be that surprised if we get done with the lecture and it's only going to be around 9 o'clock. All right. This is, like I said, not a particularly long chapter. So what I'm going to do at 9 is we'll see. I mean, I can go and I can begin going over chapter 18. But like I said, I'm more concerned with everybody sending me that email again saying, yes, I want you to go through it, or no, I don't really care. And you know what? If I get one email out of 6, that's telling me that 5 people either didn't watch the video, or 5 people out of 6 don't care. All right. I don't know which way to take it. I mean, the biggest part of this class that's been, it's different for you, I'm sure, but it's also different for the instructor, is not being able to see your faces. I can sit there and say, do you get that? And Grant, you've been good enough to be the one person who's here, and you can say, yes, I do, or no, I don't. But with the rest of the people in the class, I'm not seeing their faces. I have other people that I meet with regularly on Teams, or that I email back and forth with regularly, but I've got to take their word for it that yes, it's making sense, or no, it's not. All right. So it's broken down into 3 parts: an introduction to the built-in system.io. So in other words, when we want to be able to work with files, we've had using system, using this, using that at the top of our programs. You need a using system.io if you want to be able to read from files and write to files. All right. So we'll talk about that. And as it says, there are built-in classes for managing the different parts of a file. And you can see the other stuff that's in here. Then it'll be broken down and we'll talk about how to work with just text files and then how to work with just binary files. So you'll notice how to write a text file, how to write a binary file, how to read a text file, how to read a binary file, a class that works with a text file, a class that works with a binary file. All right. So again, the stuff that's in here is going to be very similar, just so you know that. All right. So let's jump in here. And again, there is a lot of stuff that's provided for you as far as being able to work with files. And that's good news. So you don't have to worry about that yourselves as far as writing that. That's the good news. The bad news is you have to know what it is and how to use it. All right. So we're going to turn to the next page in just a second. But as it says right here, that figure summarizes the classes that are in the system.io namespace to allow you to do things like create a directory, which is a folder, or delete one, to determine if something exists, and to be able to take files and manipulate them. In other words, being able to copy them from one folder to another, being able to delete them, being able to move them from one folder to the other. Again, as it says, being able to determine if a file indeed exists. Now, when you start talking about files, there's a couple things in here that are really important. All right. And one of them is permissions. Okay. As you'd probably guess, I've got permission. I've got permission to go in and I can go out to, we call it Google Drive here, where a lot of common information that I have, that I've created, that Mr. Gudmiston has, that he's created, that Mr. Smith created while he was here, etc. That information is out there. There are some tests out there. There are some worksheets out there with answer keys, etc. in them. I've got permission to look at that stuff. You don't. All right. because that's the stuff that we assign to you. So permissions are very important here. All right. The other thing too is you've got to be really leery of is basically access methods. And what I mean by that is if I create a new file, what happens if a file by that name already exists? Does it overwrite the file that was there before? Does it refuse to create the file because one by that name already exists? And the answer is, of course, the political answer is it depends. And that's what we're going to look at. All right. So as it says there, you typically need to use the coding directive, and that's the using system.io. Then they're going to show you some of the methods. Don't worry about memorizing anything in here. But again, if we go over something and it doesn't make sense, please ask. All right. And again, not just you, Grant. I mean, for the rest of you, if something doesn't make sense, email me and ask. So finally, it says it'll show you some of the methods of the file class. So let's take a look at what's in here. So you'll notice there's a directory class. It's funny because today most people don't refer to these as directories. They refer to them as folders, but that's what we're talking about. All right. There is a file class. As you can see, it allows you to perform basic operations. All right. In fact, what you'll learn when we get into the database is this is typically referred to as CRUD operations. Allow you to C, create something, R, read something, U, update something, or D, delete something. Now here they're just mentioning, and instead of update, they're calling it edit. All right. But you need to be able to read files too. All right. And then finally with file paths. All right. And why is that important? Well, you may or may not be aware of this, but as an example, when I created your test, or I should say created, when I graded your test for chapter 12, if you remember, we did that card shop thing. And what I had to do in order to make sure I could run your programs is when you set up your stuff, you set it up for the path. And I even showed you how to do that, but that was the path on your machine. The path on my machine was different. So I had to go in and manually change a lot of things when I graded the stuff. All right, to make sure that it worked on my machine. All right, so those are the system.io classes. And then some of the methods. I'm not going to read through each one of these. Hopefully they make sense. You'll notice the first one returns a Boolean. So yeah, true. All right, that a folder exists. False, that the folder doesn't exist. Why is that important? Because before you create a new directory, you typically would want to make sure that directory didn't already exist. All right. You can delete folders, and you've got to be real careful about this and how you set this kind of stuff up. Because notice there's a delete path and there's a delete path recursive. The difference between those, all right, is when you do a recursive delete, you're saying delete this and anything that exists underneath it, which can be very, very dangerous. All right. Some of the common methods are shown right here. And again, you can read those yourselves. All right. Hopefully, at least most of that stuff that's in there just makes sense. Again, the biggest part or the biggest thing in here is how to use these things. All right. So again, we already talked about the using system.io at the top. All right. So here's some examples. So notice what they're doing there. By putting that @ sign here, and I may have mentioned this in class earlier, I may not have, I don't know. But if you don't put the @ sign there, you're going to get an error the way that this is currently written. So how can you fix it? You can either put in 2 backslashes, so it's a C:\\\, C# files, \, because remember backslash, which is what that thing is a special character. \n is a new line. \t is a tab. So what you're saying with that @ sign at the beginning, like they're showing right there, is turn off the special meaning of the @ sign. I'm sorry, of the backslash. So that literally is a path. So that would say that on my C drive, I've got a folder called C#, and underneath that folder, I've got a folder named files. That would be the directory then. Then we're checking and we're saying, hey, if it doesn't already exist, then create it. All right. And here they're doing similar types of operations, but with a path. So notice we're saying string path equals that directory that we just did above plus products.txt. All right. And what we're saying there is, okay, if that file exists, then delete it. Right? So again, you can read the stuff that's in here. I think that we've gone over it already. The only thing that here, I've mentioned this before, but I want to say it again. The last bullet says all of the methods of these classes are static methods. What that means is, okay, there is a directory class. I don't have to make a directory object. I can use the name of the class, which is directory dot, and use these things. Same with file dot. And there are some with path that you can use with path dot. So when something is static, as is mentioned right here, what they mean by that is you don't need to create an object of the class. You can use the class name dot followed by a method. All right. Now, this may be the hardest part of the entire chapter. Okay, it says when you use system.io classes to do IO, you can use two different kinds, text and binary. We already talked about this. So again, if you look here, there's a text file. If you try to bring up a binary file in a text editor, you'll be able to read some of it, but a lot of it will look like, weird characters or whatever. All right. If you've ever done this, and I've done it on occasion, I've accidentally tried to open a zip file. All right. For example, inside of like Notepad++, and it just looks like a bunch of garbage. All right. It says there in a text file, all of the data is stored as text characters or strings. Yeah, that's true. All right. It says the fields are separated typically by delimiters. They could be a tab, they could be a pipe, they could be a comma. There's a lot of ways that you can break them up. And the records are separated by end of line characters. So in other words, if I had a list of all the people in this class, and let's say it was an alphabetized list, I might have last name, comma, first name, comma, middle name. Then on the next line, I'd have another student with last name, comma, first name, comma, middle name, etc. That's what they're talking about. All right. You don't see these end of line characters when you hit the enter key, but they're there because each record is starting on a new line. All right. On the other hand, as it says, the data in a binary file can include text characters as well as data types. What the heck does that even mean? Well, let's really simplify it, even simpler than they have there. Think about a Microsoft Word file. All right. And everybody, I'm sure, has seen a Microsoft Word file at one time or another. So if I bring up one, all right, here's one that the students have for an assignment they've been working on. And if I come in here and I decide where it says figure out the person's BMI using this criteria, I could come into this criteria here and I could bold it and I could underline it without a problem. But there is no way that if I am working and I had this file in either Notepad or Notepad++, they don't have the ability to do that kind of stuff. All right. So as it says, because it can include the data types, the data isn't always displayed properly within a regular text editor. All right. Okay. So as they mention here, and this is where, like I said, I'm not saying it's hard, but it's a little different way of thinking of things. So it says to handle the I/O with both text and binary, .NET uses what's referred to as streams. Many books will liken a stream to a fire hose. I've even heard it called that. So in other words, the fire person turns on the hose and the water comes shooting out. And as it says there, with the flow of data from one location to another, just like the water from the hose is coming from the hydrant, to a house where they're trying to put out a house fire, for example. All right, so it says, for instance, an output stream can flow from the memory of the application to a disk file, and an input can go the other direction. Okay, so when you work with text files, as it says, you work with text streams. When you work with binary files, you work with binary streams. So it's just your data basically flowing out of wherever it is or flowing into wherever you want to save it to. So we will look at these classes in just a minute. So as it says, to create a stream that connects to a file, for example, you use the file stream class. Then to read it, you use the stream reader class. If it's binary, you use the binary reader class. So the big thing is if you are working with a .txt file, you'll use all the text stuff. If you're working with anything else, you'll use all the binary stuff. All right? Okay. It says, since you can store all of the built-in numeric types in a binary file, this is more efficient for applications that work with numeric data. By contrast, numeric data in a text file is just stored as characters. So in other words, in a text file, they're all strings. All right. And you already know this from the stuff that we've covered in this class, that if you're working with strings and you want to be able to use a string as though it was a number, you've got to use either a parse, a try-parse, or a convert or something like that. All right. So when we look in here again, I already mentioned those to you. I showed you those. But these are the two types. I don't want to sit and read this to you. All right. As we mentioned previously, all right, you can see these. File stream to both kinds, stream reader and stream writer, binary reader and binary writer. All right. And we're going to basically be concentrating, like I said, on the textual stuff. All right. So how to use this class. It says there, to create a stream that connects to the file, you use the file stream class. We're going to look at that in just a moment. All right. It says that it has two arguments. The first is the path for the file. All right. And the mode in which it will be opened. I mentioned before when we talked a little bit about access permissions and modes, that can be very important. We're going to look at that in just a second. All right. It says the last two specify how the file can be accessed and shared are optional. So most often they're going to be left off. All right. To code mode, access, and share arguments, you use the file mode, file access, and file share. We're going to look at those right now. All right, so let's turn to that. Now, it's not important that you memorize any of this. All right. In fact, believe it or not, there's very little when you work as a programmer, for example, that you need to memorize. But what you do need to do is you need to be able to know where to go to look things up. All right. And all of you, I think, in many ways, I don't mean to sound corny here, but are blessed to have something like Google. Because in my day, when I was doing this and I was writing programs and I didn't know how to do something, I had to go out and grab a manual, look through the manual, and then hope they had an example. There was no Google. All right. So as it says there, the members in the file mode enumeration. Append means that you've got, if the file exists already, what you do is you've got a special thing that's called the file pointer that shows where in the file you are. And if you open something in append mode and that file already exists, all right, it takes that file pointer and it moves it to the end of the file. So you don't overwrite anything. All right. And then it allows you to go and add more data, appending it on. If the file doesn't exist and you open it up in append mode, you create it. As it says, this can only be used for writing. It doesn't make sense to read with append mode. All right. Now notice the next one, create. Creates a new file. If the file already exists, it's overwritten. I have done work in other languages before where people have come up to me, and we've done some more extensive work than we're doing here with file IO, and they said, I had this big file and it had about 70 or 80 different lines in it. And then I came in and I used create and it overrode what was there. And now I replaced it. There's only one line. How do I get my stuff back? And the answer is you don't. That if you didn't make a copy, you got to start all over again. Because as it says, when it creates a new file, but if it already exists, what it does is it moves that file pointer to the beginning of the file, whether there's one record in there, one line, or a million lines. And as soon as you start to write something, it overwrites everything. Well, typically you don't want to do that. So rather than create, if there was going to be any problem with it, as it says there, you use a create new and you'd put it in a try catch block. That way, if you tried to create a file and it already existed, you could throw an exception that says file by that name already exists. All right. Open, as it says right there, opens an existing file. Again, you'd put that into a try catch because if you try to open a non-existent file, open itself will throw an exception. Open or create, as it says, same kind of thing, but if the file doesn't exist, rather than throwing an exception, it'll create the new file. All right. And truncate, notice opens an existing file and truncates it so that its size is 0 bytes. So again, basically what it's doing there is it's moving the file pointer to the beginning of the file. All right. And as far as accesses, if you've got the ability to read a file, just read permission, you can read from it, but you can't write to it. If you've got read-write permission, you can do both. And if you've got write permission, which doesn't happen that often, you can write to a file, but you can't read to it. All right. I'm not going to go through the file share enumeration because it's not used very often. All right. But that is, if you want to, as it says there, can other applications open it? All right. And I wouldn't worry about it for what we're doing in here. The common method, well, if you open a file, you should always close it. Now, if for some reason you've opened a file, you've run the program, and now you close the program, and oh man, I didn't close that file. When you close the program, that file will be closed for you automatically. But if you are working in any kind of a situation where there's possibly multiple people using the same file, you want to get in and get out. In other words, you want to open the file, do what you got to do to it, then close it so that if someone else needs to use it, they can. All right. So as it says, operating system level permissions may limit which file access and share options you can use. Sometimes, for example, if you work with Unix or the Linux operating system, you don't have to worry about this. But when you work with Linux, when you create files, you can set it up so you can read the file, you can write the file, you can execute the file, and nobody else can do anything with it. All right. There's an example of an operating system permission which could limit what other people could do or even what you can do. All right. These exception classes, I already mentioned them. So here are some of these exception classes. IO exception. All right. Why would you get an IO exception? It says the base class for exceptions that are thrown during the process of a stream, a file, or a directory. Well, you see below it are some other exceptions that are more specific. All right. So you would want to throw a directory not found exception before you threw an IO exception, etc. But with these, things can potentially go wrong when you're working with files. Either A, the file doesn't exist, or B, the file exists, but you give it a wrong location, or C, the file exists, but you don't have the permissions to do things with a file. All right, so those are the kinds of things that can happen. So as shown right here, and as I mentioned previously, when you are going to work with files, virtually 100% of the time, you will do them inside of try-catch blocks. and you will catch the different errors that can come across. All right. And again, if you just catch IO exception, that's the most generic. So if you catch that just an IO exception, just that, and you go and you do that, if you remember when we did that message thing where we printed out the system message, you're going to get a very generic message. But if you do these other ones, the directory not found, the file not found, etc., and you do those and you print out the message, you're going to get a much more specific type of message. And that's what they're basically saying in here. All right, so we're going to spend quite a bit of time right now on text files. And when we get done, we'll spend just a little bit of time and say, that's pretty much, this is how you do it in a binary file, etc. So again, notice to read and write characters, you use stream reader and stream writer. All right. It says when you work with text files, you need to use the techniques. Well, we talked about some of those before, for putting strings together using the plus sign, for parsing, etc. And you know how to do all that stuff. So how to write to a text file, they show it right here. So as it says, this figure shows you how to use the stream writer class to write data to a text file. Now the bottom line is this, all right? And you might look at it and go, man, this seems like a lot of work. Yeah, and because one of the reasons that it's a lot of work is if you're going to do things where you're going to be writing to files or reading from files, you would have the ability to possibly go in and corrupt that data, whether you did that purposely or accidentally. All right. And they want to make it as hard as possible for you to do. And what I mean is they want to make sure that when you write the code, you know what the heck you're doing. All right. So some of these methods, notice write, which as it says, writes the data to an output stream. Then there's write line, which is the one you'd use most often, because that's basically the equivalent of you writing out a line of data and hitting the enter key. All right. Okay, and then close, we already talked about that if you open up something, you should close it. So let's look at this example here. It looks a little ugly. Why? Because what do we have here? We're creating a new stream writer object, which is a type of file stream object. All right, and like I said, it looks a little ugly. So this text out that's right here, all right, it says here text out, and that is not a text box. That's just a variable that we're calling. And we're creating a new file stream. We're giving it a path, we're giving it a create mode, and we're giving it write access. And we're wrapping all that stuff inside of a stream writer object. Then what this is going to do here in this for each loop, it's going to write it out. The difference between that code, that for each statement with those 4 or 5 lines that are there, this is the first time this semester we've been always using what's referred to as the standard input devices and the standard input device and the standard output device. They're typically called STD in and STD out. Well, all semester, our standard input device has been the keyboard. It's always been the keyboard. And our standard output device has been the screen. We've either put stuff and we've done a console.write or a console.write line where we actually printed it on a console app, or if we wrote a GUI, we put that information inside of a label or inside of a text box or something else. Now what we're doing is we're changing our standard output device so that rather than writing it to the screen, we're writing it to a file. So that data will persist. So this text out where we're doing the dot write, that's actually going to write that information out to a file that has this path. And if it's there, if it's not there, that, remember with that create, if it's not there, it's going to give us an error. But since we're giving it write access, I believe it's just going to create it if it's not there. But then it's going to write this information out for each product we have. The advantage of doing that is if we're going to go and let's say we've got 100 products, we could put them in once and then be able to bring them back again and use them in the program. If we've got 100 different products, we don't want to have to enter that information in every single time we're doing this. That would be foolish. All right. So hopefully that made, like I said, at least a little bit of sense. So that's the writing. Well, then there's the reading. All right. And when you read, a couple things about this that are in here. The first thing there is it says there's something called peak, P-E-E-K. And peak is what's referred to as a look ahead function. So imagine I had 30 people in my class. And now I'm going through and I'm figuring out grades and I'm figuring out the high grade and the low grade and the average grade, etc. But let's assume for a second I don't know how many people are in my class. I could use the peak method and that would look ahead and go, yep, there's another student. Yep, there's another student. Yep, there's another student. When it gets to the end, rather than seeing another student, it sees what's called an EOF or an end of file marker. So it returns -1 when everything has been read. All right. The read, as it says, can be used to read something a character at a time, which is, you might guess, that would probably take longer. Read line will read a line at a time. And read to end starts from where you currently are and it reads to the end. Now, when you think about it, all right, and you put it in the context of, let's just say, for example, the page that we're on right now. Read would take longer because you'd be saying, if I went up to the top of the page, I've got a T, then an H, then an E, then a space, etc. The read line would say the basic syntax for creating a stream reader object, that'd be one line, then it would do the next line, etc. All right. With the read to end, it would be like handling this as one big page. All right. And close, as we said, when you open something, you always want to make sure that when you're done with it, it's just considered good practice to close it. All right. All right. Now, this right here, there's nothing at all wrong with what they're saying in here. You may find this the hardest part of the chapter. All right. Because they try to give you this using statement and this using declaration. All right. And they give you this to try to make it your code a little bit more efficient. That's the good news. The bad news is it can actually make what you're working with harder to understand by using this. All right. So it says there in previous examples, we talked about using that close method. It says when you call close, the objects are closed and the resources are basically released from memory. And as I mentioned, if you forget to close them, they aren't released until the garbage collector comes and releases them. That's not really true. If the program keeps running and you don't close something, all right, it will eventually close. But if you forget to close it, you have no guarantee as to when it'll be closed. And that's what they're saying here. And if you look at that garbage collector, people hear that and they go, what the heck is that? Well, what happens is .NET works with your operating system. Okay. Now, I'm telling you something here that I'm dating myself. So you may understand what I'm saying and you may not. All right. Back when I went and got my 4-year college degree, all right, I went to the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And the reason I'm telling you this is the parking, it may have changed since then, but the parking was horrendous. All right. If you were lucky, you found a 2-hour parking spot. All right. And what would happen quite often is they'd have what they called meter maids. These people would go around and they'd put a chalk mark on your tire. Okay. And if they came back 2 hours later and the car wasn't moved and they saw the chalk line, you'd get a ticket. That kind of thing. Well, what does this have to do with anything? It's kind of how the garbage collector works. So what the garbage collector does is it runs through the operating system and it says, hey, .NET, if you got a couple seconds here that you're not doing anything, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to mark anything in the program that's not being used right now. All right. So it does that. Then it comes back a little bit later and it says, okay, this still is marked as not being used. So usually it'll take whatever memory that was in there and it will release it. It'll get rid of what was there. That's what I'm telling you. So what they're saying here is if you've got to do all this stuff yourselves, it can cause inefficient code or you can forget to do some of it. One way to prevent it, as they mentioned there, is to use this using statement. All right. And when you use the using statement, okay, it says it uses a using statement to declare the stream writer and the file stream. It says this causes them to be released automatically when the code is done being executed. So you don't have to close things. So again, it's written as a nicety for people, but sometimes when people see this, they get totally confused and they're, I don't want to use this. Well, if you don't use it, then you're responsible for all the work. All right. It says there another way to prevent these from being retained is to use the using declaration. So let's take a look at these. They're the things that you see in there that are in yellow. So if you look at the first example, you'll notice it's the same code we had before. All right. Except we've got the word using out there and we've got all of this, all of the rest of this here after the word using. I guess I can't highlight it. That's all in parentheses. So again, the advantage is you don't have to do a close. After it runs this and it writes all that information out, it'll automatically close the stream reader and the file stream for you. All right. So that's using a using statement, and there's a using declaration that you can use as well. They look very similar to one another. This one, the stuff is in parens. This one, the stuff is not in parens. In here, you need to surround everything in curly braces, and in here, you don't. All right. And then they explain that in here. Okay. And again, as it says, it's a relatively new feature, which will automatically release resources for you when you're done. All right. Okay. All right. So then they have this class that works with a text file. Let's go through this. We'll take a short break and then we'll finish everything up. All right. So as it says in chapter 12, we learned how to develop this app that used this product business class. All right. And what we did at that time, it says you also learn how to use two static methods, the product DB, all right, and how to save them. It says, but we didn't learn how to code these. Now they're going to show you the code for the product DB class that is going to actually save the stuff. All right, so let's take a look at it. All right, a little bit of code here, but you'll notice we've got a using system.io, which is going to work in conjunction with the system.collections.generic. All right. And when we come in here, notice the first things that we have in here. These two private things that are up above in the class. What are those? They are still instance variables. All right. But what they're doing basically, and I guess they're not technically instance variables, but they're telling us the directory where we're going to save something, and they're telling us the name of the file in which we're going to save it. So if we were to follow this, that would mean, just so you see this, if we were to follow this, that would mean that if we went out to our C drive, C colon, that we would have a folder out there that would be named C#, and in that C# folder, we would have a folder called files, and in that folder called files, we'd have a file called products.txt. Here it is, and you'll notice that if I bring it up and look at it, that's what it looks like. Okay, so the delimiter is this pipe sign. So we've got a code, P1, a pipe sign, the name of the product, another pipe sign, and the price of the product. All right, and you'll notice that for product P3, we've got a longer description, which is totally fine. All right, but the point is we can open this up in anything. I can open this up in I could open it up probably in Word. I don't know what it would do, but should open at least. I could open it up, if I saved it as a PDF, I could open it up in Adobe, etc. But it's a text file, so it's designed to be opened up in a very simplistic editor, again, such as um, Notepad or Notepad++. Okay, so then we come in here and it's a list. But look at the stuff we're doing that we hadn't done previously. We're saying if the directory did not exist, that directory right there, then create it. All right. Then we come in here and we're attempting to create the stuff to be able to work with this product.txt file. All right. And then when we come in here, what are we doing? Well, we're basically saying here, we're making a list of products, okay? And what we're going to be doing in here is we're going to be filling that up with the information that you see in here. But again, we're going to end up writing this stuff out to a file. So when we go into the save, that's exactly what we're doing in here. And again, like I said, the whole idea is we are working with persistence. So when we get done, all right, when we're finished, that file remains so that we can bring it up again later. All right. Now we don't have much to go. We got about 10 pages. Let's just take about 10, let's take 9 minutes. It's 9:01. I'll come back at 9:10 and we'll be done by 9:30. All right. I'll see you then. All right, let's finish this up then. And again, like I said, I don't think it'll take very long because now all we're doing is we're talking about the same type of stuff, but working with it with binary files as opposed to text files. So as it says here in the figure, you learn how to use the binary writer class. All right. So you create a binary writer object. So again, the stuff in here is not identical. All right. But it's very similar. Now, they do mention here, it says the save products method in the example shows how it works. It says here a binary writer is created for a file stream that specifies that a file has only write-only access. And maybe before, because I want to make sure people do understand, there may be a reason that you give somebody write-only access but not read. And the reason that you might give them that is, think about it this way. I know it doesn't work like this anymore, but back in the day when I was your age, as they say, and I'd go into a bank and I'd go in there to make a transaction, they didn't have the big computers up there right now where they could just, a lot of times what ended up happening is they would batch together a lot of the transactions and do them at the end of the day. All right. So they may have a whole big list of deposits and a whole big list of withdrawals, etc., that they may just have done at one time or maybe every hour or every whatever. So it would make sense if somebody came in there and just had a listing of all these deposits and transactions, that if there were just a list of the amount of money and maybe the account number they went into or whatever, that the person working on that might only have write-only access. So there may be a reason for doing that. When we look at this, again, notice there's a write method, notice there's a close. When you look at this, it doesn't really look much different, except that rather than working with the stream writer, you're working with a binary writer. All right. And you're still working with the file stream. So what happens in the inside here, this line is pretty much exactly the same as what we looked at before. All right. And we've got another for each. Now, typically, when you go in and you are writing a binary file, you make sure it does not have a .txt extension. So with what I showed you before, and I unfortunately removed it, but let's bring it back up. So that C:\/ C# it was, and then there were files. And in there, now you'll notice there is a products.txt file. We already looked at that. All right. Now, if I go in there and just do this, in fact, let's make a copy of it. So I'm making a copy. There it is. And I'm going to change it from products.txt to products.dat, dat for data, which is oftentimes used with this. All right. So if I come in here now and I open it up, it still reads. But there are going to be files that when you do that and you change the extension, it will no longer be readable. All right. And I know I talked about this before, but again, if I were to come in here, these are all text files and that's fine with that dat file. But if I were to come in here and as an example, here's some database files. So this is the kind of stuff we're going to look at. All right. And if I bring this up and try to bring it up in Notepad, you can see what it looks like. That you're not going to get very much from this because you're attempting to bring up a binary file in a textual editor. All right. So what do? Well, you need to know what you need to open it. And that's why typically when you look at this stuff and you right mouse click on it, there'll be an open with, and then it'll show you what's in here. All right. And it says these files are used by the operating system and various programs. So you can click on there and you can see what you can use to open it with. All right. But even some of the files that you create inside of Visual Studio, even though you create those files, you may not be able to directly open those up from inside of Visual Studio. All right, because they're different kinds of binary files. So as it says here, you use a binary writer object to write data to a binary file. In most cases, it says you'll write one field at a time in a prescribed sequence. So in other words, it's a little bit more intricate. So for that reason, the binary writer class, as it says there, provides just a write method that determines the type of data, because it can change. It can be numeric, then it can be string data, then maybe date data, then maybe some other kind of data. All right. So that's for the writing. And again, the reading is again going to be similar to what we looked at before. But you'll notice that now rather than peak, it's peak char, because it's again reading this a character at a time. All right. And it's looking through this. I'm not going to read any of these to you, but you'll notice that many of them return a Boolean. All right. And if it's not a Boolean, it's whatever type of data you're working with. Because again, as you read through the file, the types of data that can be in there can vary. So in other words, I mean, think of it this way. What if I had employee data? I might have, for example, a first name, a middle initial, a last name, an address, a city, a state, a zip, a department you work for, a salary, maybe your social security number, whether you're full-time or not. This is all different types of data. And I may have a line in there for each employee with all that information that's in there. But I'm not going to typically save that into a regular text file for a lot of reasons. All right. One reason is, if you save something as a text file, it's also known as being basically in clear text. And you wouldn't want anybody to be able to open up that and find out information as far as, who's making how much money at a company, etc. All right. So as it says in here, you use the binary reader object to read a single character. All right. To read the single character, you use the read method. And we talked about the peak char already, or car. All right, so they go through the same example basically that we looked at before. This is identical to what we looked at before. So is this. And you can use the using statement like we did before, but again, when you use this, rather than using a stream reader, we're now using a binary reader. That's really the only difference that's in here. So it's the type of data that we're saving. All right, and we used the peak before, now it's a peak char, and we're writing it out the same way, but again, we're writing it out as a binary file as opposed to a textual file. All right, so that's it. Let's take a quick look at what we're going to do in the next chapter here. All right, and we're going to work with something that's called link. And you may find that in some ways you may think this is easier than what we just worked on with object-oriented. In some ways you may think this is harder. All right, but link, to my knowledge, it's a Microsoft feature that allows you to use things that are not databases as though they were databases. Now, we haven't really talked about databases yet, but it's okay. All right. It just allows you, for example, to use an array, and you know what an array is, or a list, and do things with it that you couldn't previously have done, that you could do with a database, but you couldn't do with an array, that you could do with a database, but you couldn't do with a list. So we're going to talk about that. And again, we'll go through, as it says, the concepts of working with link, how to write what are called query expressions, all right, how to use extensions. And I just wanted to show you something because I'm hoping that this weekend I can make modifications to what I'm about to show you. This is one thing that I wrote. All right. And what do I mean? Well, in here, there's a lot of stuff. Don't worry about what it is. Okay. But I put in a bunch of songs just, off the top of my head. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say, okay, I want you to show me every song that I've got in this list of songs, and I want you to show them in alphabetic order based on the title. And you'll notice A, B, C, etc. So you notice it looks like it works at least. All right. So there's some. So then we can do it again, and we can say, well, I don't want it by title, I want it by artist. And you'll notice now these are not in any kind of order by artist. But if I choose artist, now you can see that they're in alphabetic order. All right. Now that they're in alphabetic order, you can notice that, well, there's some country songs, there's some country songs, there's a rock and roll, there's rock, etc. So they're not in order by genre. So I can do that as well. All right, so there's my classics, country, pop, rock and roll, soft rock, etc. All right. Plus, I can go in and I can check for things. So in other words, I can come in here. I want songs by artist. All right. Well, you'll notice here, I'm going to grab one that has just a few people in it. Let's see. I think I've got more than one by Garth Brooks, but we'll find out. So let's say by artist. All right. And search. Now it'll ask. All right. So it says enter a song, artist, song artist to search for. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say Garth Brooks. And I'm going to click OK. And you'll notice there are 2 songs in here by Garth Brooks. All right. If I change that, okay, and I come in here and I search and I put in something, you know, Garth Books, so I spelled it wrong, doesn't find anything. Well, that would make sense. On the other hand, if I want all songs that are in here that are country songs, I can come in here and type in country, hit enter, and there's my country songs. All right. So this is the kind of thing that we're going to look for. Now, I wrote this. I wrote it all from scratch. There's some good things about this, and there's some bad things about this. All right. And I utilize some of the stuff that's later that we didn't even really talk about in the end of the object-oriented programming section. What do I mean? Well, if you look at what's in here, you'll notice there's even a library. All right. And so I put some of this stuff in here, and I'd like us to work with this. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that right now when you look through this, all right, there's a couple different things that are in here, but I believe that when you go through this right now, I think I've hard coded in all of the data here. I don't even remember where it is, but somewhere I believe I got all those songs and stuff. I'd like to put those into a file and be able to use a file with this. All right. And no, you're not going to have to type this stuff in. I don't know if I'm going to put it out there or not put it out there. All right. But I want to go through it with you so that at least you have an understanding of what's going on in here. That's, like I said, to me, that's what's important. So I've got this link library, and you'll notice if you look here, one of the things that's in there is something called a song manager. All right, there they are. So there's all that stuff. Now, I put all that in myself. It was a pain in the butt. It took a while to do, etc. But it would make more sense to take that information and instead of having it here like I've got it, to take it and put it into a file and allow you to read the information from files. All right, I don't have any idea if I'm going to have the time to do that this weekend or not. If I do, I'll at least give it a try. Otherwise, we'll work with this. So the plan is, I'm going to say this one last time, and I am also going to put this in the email today. I would like everybody in this class to send me an email by tomorrow morning with just 2 things in it. The first one, yes, I'd like you to do the Hot 7 test for us. And yes, I can read the thing from the URL that comes up from Teams, or no, I can't. All right. And that's what I had today, because again, I said I didn't realize or know how long it would or wouldn't take. If I hear nothing from anybody, or if it seems to be overriding that people don't care, then tomorrow we will go right into chapter 18. And then we'll work on this thing that you see on your screen now next week. Otherwise, tomorrow I will go through the test. All right, I will build everything from scratch. I will go through it, try to annotate it, etc. Put comments in there and let you know what I did, why I did it, etc. All right. So with that said, that's all I've got. So I will talk to you tomorrow, one way or the other. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.